Hi friends, John Wesley here from the Sense of Shelf podcast, and I want to tell you about Anchor. Anchor is what I use to record this delightful podcast that I am very thankful you're listening to. And Anchor has all the tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. And from personal experience, editing from your phone is surprisingly easy and intuitive. And when you host your podcast on Anchor, you can distribute it to all the listening platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. It is literally everything you need to make your podcast all in one place, one easy app. And best of all, it is totally free. So if you find yourself thinking that you may want to start a podcast, I recommend you download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get yourself started. Thank you for listening, and God bless. Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sense of Shelf podcast. My name is John Wesley. Thank you for joining me on another installment of the Pen Made Mightier by the Sword. I put the decision of this week's episode to a Twitter poll, and it seems like the winner is going to be Mr. Kurt Vonnegut. So we're going to do a brief little history on him and his experiences in war and how they influenced his works. So Kurt Vonnegut, you may recognize that name as the author of such books as Cat's Cradle, The Sirens of Titan, and the massively successful Slaughterhouse-Five. Vonnegut enjoyed a long and successful life after dealing with some harshness early on. He was born into a well-to-do family of German immigrants in 1922, and World War I had soured attitude toward German immigrants, so they faced some adversity around these times. Then came Prohibition and the Great Depression to make things harder. His mother's family owned a successful brewery, which had to close with Prohibition. And his father and father's family were architects, and business stopped for them with the Great Depression as construction came to a halt. In high school, Vonnegut became co-editor of a school newspaper, and here he realized he found writing for a large audience, quote, fun and easy, end quote. After graduating high school, he went to Cornell University, majoring in biochemistry. He again worked for the school paper and wrote a piece titled, Well, All Right, supporting pacifism and arguing against the U.S. entering into World War II. He dropped out of Cornell in January 1943 due to poor grades and being placed on academic probation. And knowing that there was a good chance he would be drafted, he decided to enlist in the Army that March. On May 14th, 1944, Vonnegut returned home on leave to find out his mother had committed suicide the night before his return. It's possible she did this due to the family's loss of status, as well as Kurt's upcoming overseas deployment. Vonnegut was deployed to Europe 3 months later in December 1944, and he took part in the Battle of the Bulge. And for those of you history nerds like myself, you know that that was Germany's last offensive of the war. Approximately 6,000 men in his division were captured, including Vonnegut. He was transported to a prison camp south of Dresden. The train these men were being transported in was mistakenly attacked by the Royal Air Force, killing 150 men. When Vonnegut made it to Dresden, he lived in wait for it, a slaughterhouse. He remembers sirens going off, warning of bombings, but the Germans had never really expected Dresden to be targeted. There were no war industry buildings there. Then on February 13th, 1945, the Germans were horrendously proved wrong. Allied forces fiercely bombed the city for a couple days. And 2 days later, by the 15th, around 25,000 civilians had been killed. Vonnegut had survived by taking refuge 3 stories underground in a meat locker. He and other prisoners were then tasked with the sad job of excavating bodies from the rubble. After General Patton captured the nearby city of Leipzig, I'm pretty sure I'm not pronouncing that correctly, Leipzig, American POWs were evacuated on foot. During this evacuation, Vonnegut was able to reach a POW repatriation camp in France with the help of Soviet soldiers. Upon returning to the U.S., he continued to serve for a little while. He was awarded a Purple Heart and was discharged soon after. In September 1945, Vonnegut married and moved to Chicago. Kurt and his wife attended the University of Chicago, and Kurt Vonnegut worked there as well. Neither graduated, however. His wife Jane dropped out due to becoming pregnant, and Kurt left without a degree when his master's thesis was rejected. Vonnegut then worked as a technical writer for GE. While working there, he had 2 stories published by Collier's, and after these stories being purchased, Vonnegut quit GE and moved to Cape Cod, Massachusetts to write full-time. He was a struggling writer with a large family for a while. Player Piano was published in 1952 to moderate success. It was a satirical take, a style he became known for, on the drive to climb the corporate ladder. For years after this, he got by publishing short stories in magazines. A while later, about 7 years later, in 1959, The Sirens of Titan was published. There's a touch of World War II influence in this novel, as the character Rumford was based on President Roosevelt. In Mother's Night, published in 1961, the protagonist is an American raised in Germany from age 11. The character joins the Nazis as a double agent for the US's OSS and rises in the ranks. After the war, the OSS denounces him. He becomes imprisoned and subsequently commits suicide. Vonnegut later wrote a foreword to this book saying, warning, "We are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful about what we pretend to be." A short story titled Harrison Bergeron was also published the same year as Mother's Night. It has been theorized that this story is a satire on American misunderstandings of communism and socialism during the Cold War. Cat's Cradle was then published in 1963, in which the narrator is intending to write about a fictional father of the atomic bomb. Then in God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, published in 1964, the character is seeking to atone for his wartime service and killing of non-combatant firefighters. Professor William Rodney Allen wrote, "This book is a more, quote, a cry from the heart than a novel under its author's full intellectual control," end quote. And that seems to have reflected Vonnegut's life at the time. In the mid-60s, Vonnegut had taken a break from writing. A few years later, though, he was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship for research in Germany. He toured Dresden while he was there, and all along Vonnegut had been writing about his experiences in Dresden, but he found nothing acceptable to himself or for his publishers. Which then brings us to Slaughterhouse-Five, published in 1969. It tells the story of Billy Pilgrim. The character was very similar to Vonnegut. Pilgrim was born in 1922 and survives the Dresden firebombing. And given the time frame and the country being embroiled in the Vietnam War when this was published, this novel found instant success. He was considered an anti-war hero and found success with this publication and toured as a lecturer for a long time. So there's probably the most examples in his works of the war influencing his work and his experiences in the wars. I think I think I named, 5 or 6 different titles with a touch of World War II influence. Never mind Slaughterhouse-5, which is not a historical account, but I think in the book he says, like, this is what happened, sort of. I think he's got a silly little prelude to it. So, thank you for joining me for this brief installment of the Pen Made Mightier by the Sword, where I, John Wesley, talk to you about famous authors and the influence that war and global conflict had on their works, whether it was their own direct involvement or just living through it in general. So again, this one was decided by a Twitter poll. I had George Orwell, Isaac Asimov, and Kurt Vonnegut up as options. And while I am recording this a little prematurely, Kurt Vonnegut does have the lead. So if you took part in that, I appreciate it. If you want to take part in future Twitter polls about what will be spoken about, find me on Twitter at senseofshelfpod. Again, that's at senseofshelfpod, and that's the same for Twitter and Instagram. Or if there is a subject you want me to discuss, an author you want me to talk about, a book you want me to review and talk about, and you don't like social media, believe me, I understand. I did not use social media until starting this. But you can contact me by email. I have senseofshelfpod@gmail.com. So there are lots of ways for you to get in touch with me. Let's have a conversation. And while you're at it, whatever platform you're listening to, whether Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, you know all the ones, do all the podcast stuff, subscribe, rate, review. Let me know how I'm doing. I would appreciate it. And I implore you to go look up my friends Ben Hunt in the Enlightened podcast, as he talks about all things nerd, whether Star Wars, cult movie classics, Harry Potter, all the above. He'll talk about all those things. You'll have fun hearing his takes and his wild friends' takes. Him and I recorded an episode about Ralph Bakshi's 1978 animated Lord of the Rings fever dream classic movie. And he's actually been on my show a couple times. We're both avid Lord of the Rings and Tolkien fans. So go check him out, the Enlightened podcast, and find his socials. He's on Instagram and Twitter. And also check out my good friend Chris Galley at Beantown Action Podcasts. He's got a few shows under that banner, all about sports and gambling on sports and fantasy football. And he's also got a nice show called Distinguished Gentlemen, which is him and 3 of our mutual friends. They talk about life, music, sports, pop culture, everything. And they have a specific beverage that they try with each episode. A certain liquor. I think the last one was Avion Tequila. So go check Chris Galley out as well with Beantown Action Podcasts, and check out his socials. He is Galley Gambles on Twitter, at Galley Gambles. I would appreciate you guys showing them love as well. So I think that does it for this Twitter voted episode of the Pen Made Mightier by the Sword. I thank you for listening. God bless.